friend David Sirota. It's been way too long since we've talked to David. He's the investigative journalist who publishes The Lever. Levernews.com is actually the website, Lever news.com. And if you haven't signed up, it's free. You can get over there and sign up and get your subscription. And he's also the host of a podcast called The Master Plan, which is absolutely brilliant. At David Sirota, of course, on Twitter, and Lever News on Twitter. David, welcome back to the program. Your master plan exposes 50-year plot to deregulate campaign finance and legalize corruption. How can they go farther than Clarence Thomas casting the deciding vote in Citizens United back in 2010?
Tom, I feel like this is a topic that you know so much about. It's really down the rabbit hole of everything that you've researched over so many years. This story starts with Watergate, as so many stories does, the post-Watergate campaign finance reforms that were supposed to clean everything up. But at the same time, there was a lot of organizing going on the right back then, catalyzed by Lewis Powell, at that point, not a Supreme Court justice yet, but head of the American Bar Association, tobacco industry lawyer, who put together the Powell memo that called essentially for the corporate takeover of the government, because the government at that time was seen by corporate forces as being too democratically responsive to what people wanted. And one of the central things that came out of the conservative movement at that time was a focus on deregulating campaign finance. So soon after that memo is written, there is an effort to put loopholes into those post-Watergate reforms that create an explosion of corporate PACs. Soon after that Powell memo and the task forces that came about because of that memo, there was the court case Buckley v. Vallejo, spearheaded in part by John Bolton. Yes, that John Bolton, who masterminded the idea that money in politics isn't corruption, it's speech. And subsequently from that, you get Lewis Powell, then on the Supreme Court, working behind the scenes at the court to take those free speech rights to buy elections and extend them to corporations. Now, you asked the question, how do you go beyond Clarence Thomas voting for Citizens United? Citizens United, of course, a group that helped get Clarence Thomas, spent a lot of money to get him on the court.
After giving him millions in bribes, he then votes their way. Yep.
I think the answer is, how do you go farther? Well, you just look back to the last Supreme Court term, which is part of this 50-year plot to legalize corruption. The Supreme Court, very few noticed it, used a small case in Indiana to essentially legalize bribery as long as the sequence of money follows what the Supreme Court says is okay. Essentially, you are now allowed to get a government favor from an elected official as long as you deliver your bribe after the fact as a so-called gratuity. That is now completely legal. I think the real question is, what now comes after that, now that essentially bribery is legal? And I guess you can let your imagination run wild on that.
Yeah, which raises what I think is a really important question, David, which is, why are these people doing this? Why would these right-wing billionaires, and that's mostly who's behind this stuff. Now we've got Leonard Leo. I don't know if you saw the piece in the Financial Times this morning about how Leonard Leo is going to spend $1 billion to try to basically destroy what he calls liberal media. He's going after Hollywood and television networks and whatnot. But what's in it for them? Why is it that corruption is viewed as a good thing by 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court and by the billionaires who fund them and Republican politicians in Congress?
It's a great question. I think it goes back to Lewis Powell's memo and what was underneath it, which is the premise that in a functioning one-person, one-vote democracy, the government can become too responsive to what the non-billionaires want. So if you look back then, if you're an oligarch, a corporate executive back then, if you're Lewis Powell back then, you're looking out at a world that just passed Medicare and Medicaid, created the EPA, declared a war on poverty, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. The list goes on. You're looking at a government that's actually responding to what people want. It's not perfect, but it's certainly more responsive than you, an oligarch, probably want. And so what Powell says is that you essentially have to use the thing, you as the oligarchy, the thing you do have a disproportionate amount of, which is not votes, but money. So in other words, corruption is the way to short circuit a functioning democracy. I put it kind of glibly sometimes during this election. I was like, if you're worried about the democracy crisis in America, let me introduce you to the 50-year plot to legalize corruption and buy almost every election that we have up and down the ballot, right? I mean, that really is the longer-term democracy crisis. Obviously, Donald Trump, who's now out saying to donors explicitly, oil donors, give me $1 billion, I'll give you the policies you want. I mean, that takes it to a comical level. What I worry about is that we're becoming inured to it, that we as a society, it's kind of like that David Foster Wallace speech where, there are two fish swimming, another fish swims by, the fish says, hey, how's the water today? And the other fish say, what's water? I worry that we now have come to think that corruption isn't even corruption anymore. It's just the way the system works. But it's not. The corruption we're immersed in is a product of specific decisions, specific court rulings, specific public policies that were put in place by specific people for a specific purpose.
Yeah, yeah. So it's basically about maintaining power and wealth, isn't it, at the top?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you can trace so many different policies back to if you're not allowed to essentially legally bribe lawmakers, you won't get those policies. If you're not allowed to, in a sense, legally bribe the Supreme Court justices, give them lavish gifts while you have business before their courts, you may not get the court rulings that we have. I think it traces back to this. I remain somewhat hopeful that the pendulum can swing back because I think the polls show that people recognize how systemic this is, how endemic it really is. But it's going to take a focus on these issues. On Bernie Sanders at the Democratic Convention, when he called it out, he got a good round of applause. But what it really means is the Democrats, if and when they regain power, they need to pass things like the Disclose Act to at least have it not be dark money, so much dark money. There needs to be a real focus on public financing of elections. I mean, these are achievable goals with enough political will.
Tell me about the Master Plan podcast.
Yeah, so what we do is we take over 11 episodes. We start in 1971 and we tell this story. So we start, as I said, with the Powell memo. We move into the 1980s, into the early 1990s, where a guy named John McCain, I think people forget about this part of his story. John McCain first comes to national political prominence in the Keating 5 scandal, which was a scandal. He's one of the five senators who pressure a federal banking regulator. And unlike a lot of politicians, he doesn't pretend it's not a big deal. He doesn't run away from it. He runs to the campaign finance reform cause with the zeal of a convert and apologizes and ultimately spearheads campaign finance reform. Now, it wasn't perfect. Yeah, McCain-Feingold wasn't perfect, but he runs for president, essentially shames George W. Bush, kind of the personification of money in politics, into supporting it and signing it. And actually the Supreme Court, the pre-Roberts Supreme Court, holds it up, says it's fine. But then what happens is that the Federalist Society and the legal movement that's been building up since the Powell memo, in many cases inspired by the Powell memo, is ready to strike over a course of, by the way, just a few months. You remember this. Rehnquist and O'Connor off the court very quickly. Roberts first going to be Harriet Miers. Federalist Society essentially declares war on its own Republican president, George Bush, knocks out Harriet Miers, gets Sam Alito, and very soon after that, you get Citizens United. We talked to the architect of the Citizens United case, the lawyer who architected that case, about his strategy. And he will say, it essentially was a plan to throw as many of these campaign finance cases at the justices in hopes that they would take one and go big. And we tell the behind the scenes story of how John Roberts essentially teed it up for Anthony Kennedy to go big, not just big, really huge. So that's essentially the story. And we end up with, well, what do we do now? And that's the final episode.
This is we're talking with David Sirota. This is the Master Plan podcast. We're talking about these 9 episodes. Levernews.com, by the way, is his website. David, for people who don't have the patience or the time or the equipment or whatever to listen to a podcast, is there a print version of this? Are you having a corresponding transcript or something like that?
Yes. If you go to our website, all the transcripts are there. And I should mention, all of the documents are there. And just to give people a taste of one that we found, you'll love this, Tom. There was an urban legend that after Lewis Powell wrote his memo and then was appointed to the Supreme Court, there was an urban legend that the tobacco industry, Philip Morris held a gala for him as a send-off. He was a tobacco lawyer, emceed by Walter Cronkite, where they gave him a judicial robe emblazoned with corporate logos. Urban legend that this thing exists. Our researchers dug it up. It's never been heard, never been really seen before, I guess except back 50 plus years ago. We found it. You can hear it. You can see it on our website. You can see the cover of it where they're giving him this robe. I mean, that's the kind of incredible
They
document.
literally did give him, so it wasn't an urban legend. It was actually just a history. They actually gave him a judicial robe covered with corporate logos?
That's exactly right. And you can see the picture of it on our website. You can see the picture of them giving it to him on our website.
That's incredible. You guys are doing great work over there at Lever News, David. You really
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Tom. And again, I just want to reiterate, I know you have been, you are an expert in the Powell memo, so I know this is like familiar stuff to you, but it is still mind-blowing. When you see the task force meetings, the secret task force meetings, who was on these task forces, it'll blow your mind.
Yeah, good stuff. You can read all about it at levernews.com. The podcast is the Master Plan Podcast. David Sirota, the guy behind it all, at David Sirota on Twitter, at Lever News on Twitter. David, thank you so much for dropping by today. It's great seeing you again. Thank you.
Great to see you too. Thanks, Tom.
Yep. Have a good one.